The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Past Virtualization Virtual Chapter meeting. This month we have Connor Cox, who's going to be presenting to us on containers. I'm going to go ahead and make him a presenter so he can bring his stuff on up here. And we want to thank Connor for coming with us and stuff. He's going to be talking about stateful containers in HA, and of course that's a new thing that we're all kind of looking at. So we're looking forward to hearing from him. And Connor, I will actually turn it over to you now.
Great, thanks so much, Tom. And thanks everyone for joining us today for this session. Tom and I ran into each other at Past Summit, and he mentioned to me that there's some growing interest in containers in your virtualization group here. So asked me to present, and just really excited to be able to have an opportunity to chat with you guys today. So thanks so much for having me. Today in the session, really the goal here is to kind of help aid in your understanding of the various options that you have for stateful container HA. And we'll talk about what I mean by that a little bit later, but really how do you handle that complexity that oftentimes comes as a result of really new technology. So Microsoft is really embracing containers, and so as things are moving in that direction, you need a means of keeping your containers highly available. So so kind of in terms of an agenda, first we're going to kind of go through some background on some of the container adoption, container challenges, kind of see what some of those trends are. And then talk about some approaches to high availability, dig into a couple of different approaches for that, and then go through a demo of making some Docker containers highly available. And this is all going to be really focused on Microsoft SQL Server, right? We're in the past group, but that's what we live and breathe. So we'll keep an eye on SQL Server containers specifically, some of the challenges associated with that, and some of the things that we can do to make them highly available. Okay, so recently there was a survey that was put out about container adoption. So this is something that was kind of an annual thing. It used to be done by a company called Cluster HQ, and they are no longer around. So a company called Portworx picked it up, and they're asking pretty similar questions. So they're able to kind of draw some conclusions over time that way. But what they're looking at is they asked 450 different IT pros about their container usage, or 453 that you can see up there on the slide. And so this one speaks to the rise of containers. So over 55% of folks are saying, yes, our organization definitely runs containers. Okay, so over half, right? A pretty significant number. And then a little fewer than 30% are saying no, and about 15% say that they don't know. Okay, so again, over 50% of organizations polled here are using containers. So those of you who are out there who are not doing containers at all, that's fine, but you're in the minority. There are various reasons why you may not be, but my personal prediction is that you will continue to be a shrinking minority in this space as containers become more mainstream. Okay, so now of those folks who are using containers, so that 55%-ish, the vast majority of them are doing so in production. Okay, so I think I speak with a lot of folks, and they say, hey, containers, that's great. It's kind of a toy for development, but we don't actually think that that's something that will be used in production. Well, this kind of says that that's not really the case. So the vast majority of folks, about 70%, almost 70%, are using containers in production. Okay, so next slide. Here is some data about which platforms containers are being run on. So as you may have guessed, the bulk of it is on Linux. This one kind of surprised me. There's actually a pretty good sized chunk that is actually running containers on Windows. About a third of organizations are saying yes, we do run some containers on Windows. So again, we sort of talked about that container push that Microsoft is doing and how they've sort of embraced the container space, and it appears to be kind of paying off. And again, just a personal prediction here is I think that Windows bar will continue to grow, and then you've got some various other operating systems that are represented here. But again, Linux and Windows taking up the bulk of this here. Okay, so what about databases? This is what's near and dear to your hearts as SQL Server professionals. Well, in the past, containers have really been focused on stateless applications. So things like web apps, right? Things that don't need to, contain state. And again, that's sort of the I guess the thing that people generally think of when they think about containers. But we can see in this question, they're asking folks, where do you plan to deploy containers within the next year? Which class of applications, which type of applications? Almost half of respondents have said that they are going to be deploying databases on containers. Okay, so again, as SQL Server professionals, we need to be thinking about this in order to A, keep our skills fresh, stay relevant, and B, not get left behind. Okay, so this is clearly where things are going, and excuse me, so it's something we need to continue to think about. So with that, around storage, okay, and availability. So how do I protect these database containers for HA? How do I ensure that that storage is dealt with? And that shows itself in this survey. So in order to deploy the containers, which challenge has been the most difficult for you to overcome? Or so it has been the most difficult to overcome. So far and away, the largest one is persistent storage. So for applications that we consider to be stateful, so like databases, that is, they contain application state, we need a means of being able to manage persistent storage. So this is especially challenging when doing high availability. So if a container that is running goes away, so does its attached storage, unless you have a means of managing that data. Okay, again, not a big deal when you're looking at things like front ends, web apps, those sorts of applications, but with databases, it is really a big deal. Okay, so kind of to sum up this, this research that we've talked about, containers are here, they are moving to production, and they're running into high availability and storage challenges, and they're being used for, or hope to be used for within the next year for database systems. Okay, so again, something we just really need to be at least aware of, if not getting our hands dirty with as soon as it makes sense. Which leads us to this next slide, which is you have a bunch of other stuff to do. Okay, including maybe untangling these wires in the server room, but you have a bunch of other deployments that you need to manage, in addition to looking at new technologies like containers, right? So just keeping the lights on, right? You're already pressed for time, and you may not have time to go out and look at these other deployments, and beyond just looking at them, you have a challenge with managing other deployments. in general. Okay, so you have other things to do. You have some non-containerized SQL Server instances. Maybe you have many of them, tens or hundreds of instances that are need to be managed in your virtual farm. And so, how do I take another way of deploying, like containers, and bring that into the fold? Okay. You're also challenged, just pressed for time around patching, updating, and doing migrations. Okay, this takes a lot of time out of your day to be able to do those activities. And then finally, high availability, right? Keeping your instances, your database instances, highly available. Okay, making sure that they're resilient in HA, and then extending that to disaster recovery if that is a requirement of the business. So again, already pressed for time. You can't necessarily afford to have an entire other operational model for your container deployments. So that kind of leads into this piece here around specifics around high availability. So with SQL Server on Windows, you have oftentimes a requirement to maintain instance level high availability. In order to do that, you need to set up Windows Server Failover Cluster and then add either I guess an always-on availability group and or a failover clustered instance to that Windows Server Failover cluster. Okay, a lot of us know how to do that, and so that's great. Then the complexity is added to if you are looking at or using any SQL Server on Linux. There is no WSFC for SQL Server on Linux, so a third-party clustering solution is a requirement. One of those options is called Pacemaker. And then you can layer on top of that, always on availability group or a failover clustered instance. I put FCI in quotes here because it is just a little bit different from a typical Windows Server failover clustered instance because you are configuring it with Pacemaker. Okay, so two very different HA solutions for those two different platforms. Now, if you want to use Docker containers with SQL Server instances running in them, you have to find something else. So there are a variety of options out there. A couple of them are listed here. You've got Docker Swarm, Kubernetes, Mesosphere, those sorts of solutions to help you through that. So again, many different HA solutions for managing HA and state. But what I want to walk you through today is a little bit of a different approach that you may or may not have heard of, and it's from DH2I, and it's called DX Enterprise. And what it does is it provides high availability for SQL Server on all of these platforms that we have listed here in the same way from the same tool. Okay, so what's really nice about this is now you've got a unified solution to be able to pull in all of these different deployments and make them HA. Instead of having to cobble things together with all of these various siloed HA solutions. All right, so just kind of want to give you a quick overview of how it works. And so really what this tool does is it abstracts or decouples or encapsulates native instances and or containers and allows them to move between hosts with the nearest to zero downtime. Key to this is it also can do so with data persistence. Okay, so very critical when you're talking about containers specifically. And when I say move between hosts, I'm talking about your SQL servers, whether they are VMware or Hyper-V guests or Zen guest or whatever hypervisor you're using. If they're guest OSs, that's fine. And or if they are bare metal. Okay, so you may look at containers and say, you know what, I kind of want to go that direction, and virtualization maybe doesn't make as much sense for me anymore. Or maybe for some of my deployments, I don't need virtualization, and that's fine. And you can use this same tool to be able to do that. So when I say from host to host, I really mean from SQL Server guest to guest in a virtual type environment. So again, very important that we have this data persistence piece. If your container goes away, or your server goes down, or whatever happens to cause an outage, it will start up on another host and attach that same data to it. Okay, so that's the data persistence part. The other part of the puzzle here is this idea of a consistent connection string. So what we do in order to encapsulate this with this DX Enterprise tool from DH2I is we use what's called a vhost, okay, in order to do that, and that provides a consistent connection string. If your container's on server 1 or server 2, you can connect to it through the same connection string. Okay, a couple other attributes of the tool, and then we will talk about, just show you a demo of it, and then get to some questions. You can use this tool to manage and make highly available native instances all the way back to SQL Server 2005 through current, so through SQL 2017 currently, right? And so again, a unified tool, manage all of these native instances all the way back to 2005. It can support Windows and Linux. So whether it's a container or a native instance, it can run on Windows and Linux. Now, obviously, if you're running it on Linux, there is a requirement that that would be SQL Server 2017, right? So Microsoft just added that capability to support SQL Server on Linux, and it's for 2017. You can support that. And it is quite flexible in terms of what it supports. So we can do, mixed distribution on Linux, mixed version on Linux and on Windows. So in other words, you could have a mixed version, you could have mixed versions of Windows, you could have mixed versions of SQL Server within the same group, again on Windows. So again, take all of what you've got, what's coming out new, containers, native instances, whatever it is, throw it all into the same HA framework and manage high availability from that single tool. By the way, it can also be used for disaster recovery. So we have a lot of folks that are using it for DR as well. Okay, so what I want to do is give you a very quick demo to help you see what this takes to set up for highly available stateful containers. Okay. What I'm going to do in the demo is manage a SQL Server Docker container on Windows. Could have picked Linux, but just picked Windows because I think that's probably what most of you guys are the most used to, and would kind of be most interesting for you. But again, it could be Linux and or Windows. So manage a Docker container on Windows, move it between hosts, so kind of do that the simulated high availability motion to move that container between the two nodes in my cluster. And with that persistent data, so the data will follow the container. Okay, again, very, very important for production stateful applications. And then finally, we will take a quick tour of a DX Enterprise cluster that has standalone instances on Windows to kind of give you a sense of what this looks like managing different workloads on different platforms. Okay, so Windows, Linux, Docker, again, all within the same tool. All right, so if you'll just give me a moment here, I'm going to pull up this demo. We'll kind of go through things here for you. Let's go ahead and switch this over. Give me a second here.
Do you need me to, well, you're still the presenter. There it is. It just came up.
All right, very good. Thanks so much. All right, so what we have here, sorry for the delay there, folks. What we have here is a 2-node cluster. And so the thing to keep in mind here is that if we are doing Docker containers, we need to be running on Windows Server 2016 because that is what Microsoft has support for. And so both of these nodes are Windows Server 2016. Okay, again, these could be physical machines, they can be VMs. These happen to be VMware guests, right? Because this is a virtualization group. And I've done a couple of things already to these systems. And what have I already done? I've installed the software, so I've installed the DX Enterprise software. I've joined these 2 nodes together, and I've provisioned some shared disks. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit more in depth about what I've done with those disks in a moment. But again, provision shared disks. And the first step to this is we're going to go ahead and create what's called a virtual host. Okay, what's a virtual host? Well, a virtual host is, all it is it consists of a host name and a virtual IP address. Okay, so these are just DNS entries. Set these up with both A and PTR records. We just need to be able to resolve this virtual name and virtual IP address. We use this tool, this entity, this virtual host, to move between underlying servers. Okay, so it moves between servers. It's active on one server at one time. And this is what creates that consistent application endpoint, regardless of where our container is running, whether it's on VMW5 or VMW8. Okay, so we'll create it. It's called vhost1. It has an associated IP address. It's got the .200.230 IP address here. And then we're saying which nodes do we want this particular vhost to be able to run on. So first, VMW5 would be primary, and then VMW8 would be secondary. If I had more nodes I wanted it to be able to run on, they could move on down the line here. Okay, so click OK. What this is going to do is bind this .230 IP address to the active node. So again, vhost1 is the .230, and it's active on VMW5. And we see that IP address bound here on the VMW5 node. Okay. So again, all we're doing is moving an IP address when we move this vhost. Okay. So next thing we're going to do is manage some disks. So another thing, as I mentioned before, I did before this demo, is I provisioned an iSCSI shared disk. I presented it to both of these nodes. I created a volume on it, formatted it, and then just gave it a drive letter. And the drive letter I gave it was G. Whatever means or method you prefer to present shared disk to both of these nodes is completely up to you. But in this case, I used iSCSI. You can use Fiber Channel, whatever it happens to be. So that would be a requirement here. And what we're going to do is add it to the vhost, associating it with the vhost. So this means wherever the vhost is active, right, wherever that IP address is bound, the disk will be owned by that active node. So in this case, VMW5 is active, So I'm going to just add this to the vhost, and the disk will be owned by VMW5 currently when I hit submit. Okay, so this protects our data. It ensures the disk comes up where we want it to come up, which is where our instances or where our container is active. And what we use is we use SCSI3 persistent reservations on that disk to set the ownership of it depending upon where it is active. Okay, so now we are free to go ahead and add a Docker container. So at this point, we can add any container that we want. So this is not restricted to Microsoft SQL Server. All that we need to do in advance is pull down the same container image on both of these nodes. Okay, we have presets already here for the SQL Server container. We also have presets for the MySQL container, Mongo, as well as Postgres. And finally, you can do this for any custom container. Okay, so for this, you can add any container you really want, as long as, again, that image is on both nodes. But for this demo, we'll just do the SQL Server, the Microsoft SQL Server, container preset. So we need to enter a few different things here. First is the Docker name. And so this is just going to be the name of the container. So we can give it any name that we want. We'll just call it MSQL1. And then the image. So again, image needs to be on both of these nodes. All I have done is pulled down the MS SQL Server image, the MS SQL Server on Windows image that is up on the Docker store. Okay, so I just took that Docker image, pulled it down on both of these nodes. So again, prerequisites that need to be done here, Docker running on both of these nodes, and an image on both of them as well. Okay, so I'll select that image that I want. If I have multiple, they'd all be listed there, except the EULA, and then enter the port that we'll be using for the container, enter my SA credentials, and then the path for the data. Now, this is really important. We want our data for this instance to reside on the disk associated with this vhost, okay, which, remember, is our G. Okay, so that's the way that we will set this up. There's also an area here if you have any other parameters you would like to add. You can do that here. Okay, so we have a list of some of the more common ones, but if you have other parameters you'd like to add, you can do that here. And then if you are at all interested in encrypting this data, you can check this box and those values will be encrypted. We're not going to add any optional parameters here, so we'll just go ahead and click OK. Okay, so what does this do? This spins up a container based on the image that resides on this node, and it attaches that disk, and that's where the data is placed for this container. Okay, so we can see various information, pieces of information about this Docker container, SQL Server running on this Docker container, and it's active on our VMW5 node. Okay, so I can see, again, this information about it here. Okay, so let's go ahead and move it to VMW8. So let's move this container or restart it on the VMW8 VM. Okay, so you may want to do this manually for some reason. Let's say you had a patch or an upgrade that you wanted to do on VMW5 to the operating system. Okay, well, this makes that very easy because you can just move the container onto VMW8 do the work you need to do on VMW 5 on the source. Okay, so it gives you lots of flexibility from that perspective. This is automatically protected, by the way, for HA. So if VMW 5 suddenly does blue screens, the container will automatically start up and attach that new data onto, or attach the existing data onto VMW 8. Okay, but what we'll do is just say, hey, start this container on VMW 8. And now what this process does is it actually stops the container on VMW 5. It then rebinds that IP address for vhost 1. Remember that .230 IP address gets bound to VMW 8. The container starts locally on VMW 8 using that local image. And then that data, that disk, is attached to that container on VMW 8. Okay, so full failover. It takes a couple seconds here for this to come up. So just click on that a couple times, and then it should come back up. And there it is. Okay, so same container, same data. SQL Server instance is now active on VMW 8. Okay, so one thing to also remember is that it has the same connection string. So if you need to connect, if you have a client that needs to connect to this container, they can do so via the vhost 1 host name, right? Via that vhost. Okay, that's associated with VMW 8 now. This has some other implications for those of you who are considering containers, and that is for updates. So what you can do is you can actually update the image, that container image, and then restart the container using that new image. So it makes updates very easy because all you're doing is making changes or updates to an image and then restarting a container. Also want to mention here, this is basically the exact same for Linux. Okay, so these happen to be Windows Server machines, but they could be Linux nodes, and I could be running Docker on those Linux machines. Okay, we can even do cross versions on Linux. So if you have a couple different versions of an operating system, that's fine. And we can even do cross distribution. So I could actually move this container from Red Hat to Ubuntu, for example. Okay, so it gives you a lot of flexibility there as well. Okay, so this presentation is really focused on containers, but kind of to end here, I just want to show you what this looks like for standalone instances on Windows. So I'm going to connect to a different cluster as part of this. So we'll show you a Windows cluster and be able to do so through our connection manager. So if you have multiple clusters, say you've got some Windows and some Linux, or maybe just different Windows clusters like I'm going to show you today, you can look at them all in the same place just via this connection manager. Okay, so just entering a passkey for a different cluster, and I can sort of get a different look at it here via what we call a cluster view. Okay. This shows me a list of the instances that are running across my cluster. I have 12 instances. You can see their names there. We can also see that they are mixed versions of SQL Server in the same cluster. Okay, again, a lot of flexibility there, pulling in different versions of SQL Server. I can then see where they're running. So I've got these green rectangles, which show me where our SQL Server instances are active. And then here I can also, so I've got 4 nodes, demo 1 through 4, they all happen to be VMware guests. So 12 instances running across 4 guests here, and I can see where they're active. I can also initiate a failover from the screen. So I can actually just drag and drop an instance over onto another node. Okay, so that's going to kick off that failover process that we all already saw. And then just want to point out here on these 4 nodes, we have some things that we're mixing here as well. So one of these nodes happens to be a Windows Server 2008 R2 Enterprise OS. And this demo 4 machine is a Windows Server 2012 Standard OS. Okay, so mixed versions of the operating system. Think about what that means for things like updates and upgrades for you. Okay, if you need to upgrade a guest to a new version, you can very simply move instances off, do that upgrade, move instances back on. Okay, so not necessarily meant to be an alternative or replacement for virtualization, but just an enhancement. Okay, it's going to give you better availability, more flexibility when it comes to planned downtime. Okay. So just kind of taking another look back here at our containerized deployment, and so that's really it. So that's how you can configure high availability for your stateful SQL Server Docker containers, and doing so with a single HA platform that covers Windows, Linux, and Docker. Okay. So with that, go ahead and turn it back over to Tom. If you guys have any questions or further questions, certainly ask them now, or you can go ahead and contact me, connor.cox@dh2i.com, and we can get those answered for you.
Okay, Connor, I've got a couple questions here for you. In the virtual machine world, we have something called the TPM, or the Trusted Platform Module, which ensures that a VM goes down, the same VM comes back, but we can't quarantine this in the container. What are your comments on this? I see that there is I see this as a major limitation to the containers. Personally, I use shielded VMs because containers seem to me to be consumption-driven approach. Do you want me to paste that in chat for you?
Yeah, could you do that just so I can take a look at it fully in context there, Tom? Appreciate that.
Sure. Let me post this 1 second, folks. There you go.
Okay, so the question is, when a VM goes down, we can ensure that the same VM comes back, but we can't guarantee this in containers. So the thing about containers is the way that it's abstracting, and that it's a little bit higher level. And so, no, it's not going to come back in the same operating system, the same VM, but it will come up using whichever image you have on the other node. So in that sense, you can control it because you can decide which image you're using on your other machines. Let's see here. And then shielded VMs because containers seems to be the consumption-driven approach. So yeah, so I can certainly see where you're coming from. One of the issues that folks see in the container world is around security. So really the gold standard has been set by VMs in terms of isolation. And so when you look at containers, you certainly need to look at the various tools that are out there for security and isolation, okay? Because that is not going to be exactly the same translation as it is within VMs. So hope I got to some of that question there. Again, if you have anything that I missed, go ahead and follow back up. Let's see. Tom, looks like another one came in. It says, is Oracle supported in containers? Yes, so absolutely. If you want to run Oracle in a container, you can do so. There actually is an Oracle database container available on the Docker store. So if you just go to the Docker store, you can search for Oracle, and you can go ahead and pull that one down. And by the way, that would be supported on this platform as well, because as we said, any container is fine to use.
All right, we'll kind of wait here a moment for any other questions that might come in. Connor, it's always a privilege meeting you and sharing with you the things going on, and we appreciate you coming by today and talk to us about containers and stuff. And as we all learn more about this new item that we're somewhat dreading, another way of doing things. But anyway, we will continue to pursue it and see what goes on. So another question's come in. So 1 second here. Can I create a custom SQL Server template to be used in a container, say with trace flags?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So any of those customizations or specific things and features that you want, you can absolutely set that up within a container. So it's really no different than today, where you're running things standalone. Your SQL Server in a container behaves very similarly. So yeah, you can absolutely make those specific customizations within SQL in a container.
Yeah, that's what I've heard too, is basically you can turn around and set up like a default, however you want to default, whether it's standard, enterprise, developer, or whatever. And then you just use that as your template, which really makes it kind of nice.
Yep, and guys, I'd certainly recommend, Microsoft again has really embraced this. They've got some good documentation out there and some how-tos on how to do some of this stuff. So if you do have some time, which is probably a funny joke for some of you out there who are really swamped, but if you do have some time, certainly just give it a try. Just kind of give it a shot and spend some time with it and see what you can come up with, because it is some pretty exciting stuff, even though you may be dreading it and it's a little bit scary.
All right, well, I don't see any more questions coming in. Connor, thanks again for coming by, and we will put this presentation up on YouTube for you, so you can go review it and listen to it again if you missed anything. And also, you can go out there and look at the other past presentations that we have up there on YouTube. I'll try to get that up there this weekend for you. Thanks again, and have a great day. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.